One time he sent me to the store to get some cigarettes for him. Mm-hmm. When we was growing up, you could go get your parents' cigarettes. Kids can't do that no more. I went up to the corner, Mr. Bryant, and Mr. Bryant said my father, he smoked Tarleton Hundreds, and they didn't have them. And Mr. Bryant said, you know, tell your father I'll hold a carton for him, they come in tomorrow. Oh, cool, they didn't have them. So I started walking home, and my friends were playing, so I just got distracted, and I'll never forget the image. And I turn and I see my father with no shirt on walking up the middle of the street. And I was like, right? And I was like, Mr. Bryant said they didn't have them and that he'll hold a carton for you. And he said, when I send you to do something, there's two possibilities. One, you complete the mission, or two, you're dead.
This is the Dope Black Dad podcast. My name is Marvyn Harrison. I am here today with my esteemed colleagues and co-podcasters. We have Chris Becks, who's in Australia. We have Marvyn Critchlow, who's somewhere in South London, preferably not doing anything illegal. That's what they do down there. And McDonald Butcher, who's on a farm somewhere, rearing, I was going to say something wrong, but rearing something that you shouldn't be rearing. How is everyone doing today?
More than one way. What do you mean, Chris?
I said wearing more than one ring.
Oh,
so
right.
One on your
Yeah, what's that about?
And one somewhere else. I don't know where.
Yeah, explain it,
What?
What do you know that I don't?
Chris has got spicy. You know, when someone gets a little bit of like Encona hot sauce in their day, they're like, oh, here we go, spicy.
I just know about your farm, and so I thought maybe you wore different rings.
Okay.
But it's cool because I've got a juju.
Yeah, I think that's a slave mural, isn't it? It's like, it shows us being captured or something.
Yeah.
In Australia, won't surprise me at all.
I'm feeling grizzly, but not as grizzly as Don. He is the beard king, followed by Marvyn Critchlow.
Yeah, I'm trying to catch up.
I'll take third place with light.
How are you third place, bro? You shaved your face. How can you be third? Look, bro, I've got something going on.
Desperate Dan.
He shaved his face, but still got more hair than you, bro.
All right. Beard jokes, yeah?
And I've got the flow as well.
All right. Do you see that nod? That nod is so that. All right, cool.
Okay,
No, that's
cool.
cool. No. You tell your jokes. It's cool. I'll wait. So we just wasted 5 seconds of a podcast talking absolute nonsense. Today, what I really wanted to talk about is the Red Couch Talk, which was held with Will Smith and Jada Smith. It's super interesting because I don't think we have many visuals of highly functioning, highly successful black couples where they're both in the public eye, but also have an insight into the things that happen in their home, in their families, and the lessons that they've discovered in doing so. And so, Chris, you're crunching your face. Is that right? Is that true?
No, I believe you. I agree, actually. Please continue.
Cool. Thanks. And so what I wanted to talk to you about today is we all watched, or some of us watched, the Red Couch Talk and did our homework to have a relevant voice on this subject. Some of us didn't. Some of us didn't even know there was a call today and arrived late and now need to leave early. But we won't go into that at all because that's not important. What's important is the lessons and the stories within the episode, which is 40 minutes long. There were some incredible stories and incredible testimonies. Will Smith broke down at parts. They both broke down at parts. There was kind of this insight into how he became him through the lens of his father.
When do you think your fatherhood instincts kicked in?
From the time I was 6 years old, I wanted to be a father.
Right.
I loved how my family was, but there were massive critical deficiencies in my father's parenting that I wanted to correct.
Okay.
By the time I was 10 years old, I remember looking at my father thinking I could do it better than him.
And what made you think you could do it better?
My father had a little bit of a temper.
Yeah.
And I was a gentle kid.
Right.
Like, I was not a kid that you had to slap or
Right.
punch or beat. So, growing up in a household where physical aggression was approved of, that really chafed my hide.
It just was incredible. Like, I suppose for you guys, how do you? Because I think Will Smith described knowing he wants to be a dad at 6 years old. Can you remember that time where being a dad was important to you, or when that kind of hit you as a milestone you wanted to experience? Any of you?
No, I do remember that time, but it was much older than 6. And funny, when he was talking about the sentiment of how not to do it with his children, I also remember that time. I remember that time very clearly, thinking I don't want to do it the way you've done it, because the way you've done it is nonsense. But then what was really, really kind of like got me standing up was, if you think about, he didn't want to do it like his dad, but he became his dad.
Yes, the better parts. So in what way do you think he became his dad? Because I think that's quite interesting as well.
Because he didn't want to do it like his dad, but he became quite militant, like his dad wanted him to be. Like his dad educated him, he became the educator for his children, like his dad was. So it was quite surprising. If you look at if you listen to the relationship he had with his sons, and then the relationship he then tried to transfer onto his daughter, was very much his dad.
Yeah.
But
have you found that with your sons and your daughter? Because your daughter's the oldest. Did you find you had to make a huge adjustment between what you did for your daughter and your sons? Are you indirectly more harder on them, or?
I'm harder on my daughter because she's the eldest. Subconsciously, because in my mind, I guess I've always thought of her as, if I'm not around, if her mum is not around, she's the one to hold the fort down, right? She's the one to present the North Star for her brothers. So, but our relationship has always been very different. She's always been very loving from the word go. And I think girls have this special ability to just melt you away. Whereas with the boys, I'm a bit more,
Do you feel like that's going to be problematic in the long run? Is that is baked into your parenting, or do you think is workable?
I think there's adjustments to be made, and adjustments are constantly being made, to kind of rework and reimagine what happens with the boys, to find a loving, softer side to them. Now, my middle one is more, I would say he's more sensitive than my daughter. So the way I treat him is very different to the way I treat his younger brother, which is kind of, it's a very weird dynamic, I find, a lot of the time, because I'm more sensitive with him but harsher on his younger brother. But then I'm very sensitive with my daughter, but also very harsh on my daughter.
Yeah. Marvyn, according to the Daily Mail, you're a scary man with a deep voice, that's very intimidating. How do you approach your parenting? Would you identify it as more militant, more caring? How would you balance the two?
I think, just like you said, I think it's I tried to balance it well. Just reflecting on my childhood, I went to a boys' school, and I went to one of the worst schools in South London. And I see Chris is big enough as well. But I think going to a boys' school.
Name the school. Name the wonderful institution that gave you the framework that you use today.
I went to a school in Lewisham called St. Joseph's Academy.
Right. Even I know about that. Lord.
Just a notorious school. It was really bad. But I think the foresight that I was able to benefit from is I've seen hundreds of different, young men growing up, and I've seen the outcome later on in life as well. So I've had the friends, like you probably would be able to empathize. I had the friends who, Saturday morning they had to tidy up their house before they left the house, and their parents were really militant. And then I've seen what they've achieved later in life, and whether there's a correlation. I've seen the kids who maybe were a bit more free-spirited and allowed to do what they want, and I've seen the correlation later in life. So I think for me, there's a bit of balance where no one style suits every child, and you need to be adaptive. And I think that's what I've tried to do, because I've had kids that literally have sat next to me, maybe even smarter than I was, but perhaps because of their parenting, because of then their life choices, they've had a negative outcome. And so I think that's something I've tried to navigate with my son, that I don't want to be too harsh in one area or too soft in another area, and then kind of, spoil him as a child or as an adult. Because I don't know separately if you've heard of adverse childhood experiences.
No.
So it's like a new it's not new, but it's fairly new, kind of psychologists' understanding of childhood development. And what they've essentially said, if you've had 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences, you're much more likely to be overweight, to commit crime, to, you know, to go to prison, to kill, to be alcoholic. And it's all about how your brain develops as a child. And what they've correlated is a lot of people that are now in the criminal justice system
had 4 events or more.
Yeah, had 4 events or more, exactly.
Wow. So Chris, you haven't seen it, so I have a slightly different question for you for your disobedience and petulance as a brother of ours.
You're outing me now.
I had to get there. In terms of the sort of historic parenting that may have happened pretty much all the way up until 90s, 2000s when Childline was introduced, that form of like very disciplinarian type parenting, whether you can call it Pan-African, colonial infused, or military in Will Smith's dad's case, that type of style of parenting versus the more sort of nurturing parenting that seems to be happening now, or the hybrid that's happening now, how would you characterize the effects of the 2 different styles? Obviously, probably potentially being, I don't know for sure, but being on the receiving end of one and giving another. How would you characterize the 2?
I think how would I characterize? I think they're just both extremes, really. I'm quite, now we're speaking this out loud, I feel quite fortunate actually, because my mum was fairly passive. You would only see the worst of her if, you know, you created a situation that involved danger, that involved the police, or that involved harming the family. Those are the 3 times you're going to see the worst of my mum. Other than that, super passive, and kind of happy to let us get on with our own passions and our own goals. My dad was not super present, but he is definitely more the disciplinarian type, and making his presence known was more important than the actual discipline and authority that he tried to display. But yeah, what I wanted to say about, because you mentioned Will Smith became his dad, it's funny because there's a conversation that really strikes me, and this was before I started. It might have triggered what my first thoughts about how I was going to be as a parent, where I was doing a counselling class, studying like how to be a counsellor, and this guy said, the teacher said, your parents always impact your life, and you should thank them for their impact on your life, regardless of what impact that is. I said, I have nothing to be thankful for to my dad. I don't really rate him, you know, in that way. And at that moment, that was true. And he said, okay, so what's your experience of your dad? And I explained. And then he said, so he's kind of showed you what not to do, would you say? And I was like, yeah.
Yeah.
I had to accept that, and I have still made some of the same mistakes my dad's made, funnily enough. It's like sometimes you resist something so much. I've heard this thing to be true, where you can resist something so much that you become it. But
yes, you end up creating what you're trying to avoid with your actions. It's a subconscious understanding. So then would you then say, so I know Donald, Chris and myself, we have daughters. I'll speak about my daughter. My son came, and I was able to mold him very much in what I wanted in my head a young boy to be, and that was for the first maybe 18 months of his life, 2 years, very much trying to coach him into a way of being. My daughter, on the other hand, who's now 2.5, has completely rejected the coaching. She doesn't respond to it. Even today, she was coming into my room and be like, no, you do it. And it wasn't even like an aggressive, it was like a clear command of, I want you to put my clothes on. I'm not doing it. And I almost just couldn't believe that she was like this person, and still in a nappy, walking around commanding me. Donald and Chris, have you found your daughter to have a different frequency than you were familiar with when you were growing up? Is that just down to parenting, or are just girls fundamentally different and require a completely different mental approach?
Yeah, I don't know if it's down to gender or not. But so I always think when I see families with like multiple siblings, like say 3 or more, there's always one that is like the unconventional one, not to characterize. In my family, I know who that is. It's not me. But
No way.
it's not me. It's not me. But with my daughter, what I see is she's very high energy. She's very outspoken, and the parenting style's difference, I would say, that is going to impact her would be that her mum is quite, she is quite, how can I say, she's research led. She likes to research everything about what's best for children, and she's thorough. Whereas I am a little bit more, I think I would say I probably encourage a bit of carefreeness.
Yep.
I'm not as risk averse. So I think with just obviously I only have one girl, but with that, I think you're going to see that, I think I'm going to see that she naturally takes more to one particular style. And that will be her personality, and that we'll accept that.
Cool. So Marvyn and Donald, do you push your ambitions / wishes onto your child? Like, is that do you have an idea of who they're going to be, and that's what you're trying to guide them into? I suppose from looking at my son, there's a couple of times where I caught myself trying to make, or I was reliving my 4-year-old experience through my son, and I had to like hush up and get out of the way. Because I felt like I was putting too much into him that weren't just values, they were like the story of why he should, to kind of bake it in. I was doing a bit too much. How have you handled the sort of desires, ambitions, and wishes of your children? Marvyn, your child is 8, 9?
He's 10. He's
10
now. Yeah, 11.
So he's in the game. I suppose it would be relevant to hear from you. How are you approaching your son's ambitions as he's about to start secondary school?
Yeah, I think initially, I was kind of putting my ambitions on him. You know, from early, he said he wanted to be an architect. So I'm like, yeah, you're playing Minecraft. You know, we're going to go do open house. We're going to go look at buildings and stuff like that. But then sometimes that changes, and he's like, you know what, I hate buildings. I hate drawing, and it kind of hurts me at the time. But then what I've realized is that there's other ways to get to the same goal. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the initial path you've sent out. I guess it's an iteration. So you might start with one approach, but then I've learned how to iterate. And what's been really useful to me actually is I've got to a stage when I realized everyone around me has similar life experiences to what I've had. So by getting out and getting into different networks and mixing with different people and just seeing how they raise their kids, looking at, for example, white middle class people and how they raise their kids, it's much more carefree than perhaps the background that I had or some of my friends had. So I've adopted a lot of that. So there's a lot of activities and things that my son does or that I'll allow him to do that I wouldn't have went there. It would have just been, you know, riding my bike and playing football when I was younger. Whereas I'm much more willing to get him into different things because people that I sit next to in the office, I can see the benefits of those rich experiences.
Yeah.
I work with people that went skiing every year since they were 6, and I'm like, there's no black person that I know that went skiing. And you know, it's just little things like that that I've kind of learned from, and I've seen how that can add so much richness to you later in life. So I think that's why I try to be a lot more nuanced with my son. So initially, I think I was trying to father him in a way that he can survive in the world that I grew up in, but he's not going to grow up in that world because I'm not going to allow it. So now I'm trying to direct him how he can be amongst the best.
So do you think that's the reason why that you did that?
I think subconsciously, yeah. I think as a, you know, as a black man, you know, growing up in London specifically, and you just what I tend to think, I think it matters who you were in the playground. So, you know, in the playground, you had a lot of different personalities. You had the kind of quiet boys that were probably playing with poker.
Who were you? I know the Daily Mail puts you as the physical beast in the group.
Where, I mean, I think I'm fortunate, whereas my dad's a martial artist. So my dad, he's in his 60s now, but he's been doing Muay Thai and Taekwondo's for like the last 40 years.
Understood. So don't upset you too much. Cool, go on.
So I grew up doing martial arts as well. So I think I could always handle myself. But I was perhaps the person who sometimes trying to fit in, I kind of hid my intelligence a little. So I'd be in a top set, for example, but none of my friends were in a top set. I'm with the other boys in the school, the boys that maybe are less popular, where my friends that I want to hang out with, they're in some of the lower sets. And so what I've acknowledged as I got older is perhaps I hid my intelligence or I limited my potential by the people that I chose to hang around with.
Yeah.
And I think in my son's world, he just doesn't need to do that. I think the world is completely different for one. And I think for two, there's not the same level of kind of like social acceptance as we had when we were younger. When I was younger, it was like you were a rapper, you were a football player, or you were a gallus, or you were a bad man. Like that was pretty much all the options you had if you wanted to survive. And
isn't that incredible though? That's the barometer for who you could be. Is basically those things. There was never anything else greater accepted. Did you find that problematic, or that framing of who you could be quite challenging? I'd also like to go to Donald as well.
Which one were you, Donald? First of all,
yeah, I was
me.
Yeah.
I was a super smart one that just stayed quiet most of the time.
So what happened?
When
said
do
was. I was checking.
No, I think I was one of these kind of popular but just quiet kids at school. I just went about my business because for me, I always had an entrepreneurial mindset. I was always the kid that thought about selling stuff to the students at school first and foremost. Tried to make money. I always thought about how can I make money? How can I get to somewhere before anyone else? How can I buy that next pair of trainers before anyone else gets it? So I was always thinking along those lines. So I never really messed around on the playground. If I walk around the playground, I'll see people kicking a football and I'll notice that, okay, the football will go missing. They're going to need replacement footballs. If I go and buy 3 footballs, I can sell them the football for £7.50 if I bought it for £3.
You were a tuck shop kid then, who had like a tuck shop in his tuck shop in his bag, basically selling things that have 60% markup.
Yeah, basically that was me. And I think it's as I grew up, I, like Marvyn said, you kind of hang around with all these different characters, and then as you grow up, you start appreciating their differences a lot more, because like you said, you had a kid that went skiing, and I always wanted to go skiing, but that wasn't really keen on the cold. If there's a warm version to the skiing, then yeah, I would definitely go. But I was always interested in what everyone else was doing, but also quite envious of what they were doing. But how that's transpired to my children is I've just had for the first 2 years, I was adamant that my son was going to be a baller, because I was like, right, take him to football lessons every week, sometimes twice a week, practice with your right, left foot, make sure you're fleet-footed, you're going to play football. And he loved it. But then very quickly he was like, right, Daddy, I want to be a racing car driver. I don't want to play football. And I was disappointed. So I thought, well, I'll just keep taking him to football, and hopefully that dream of racing car driver will die out.
Do you just think that we are, living a haunted past of what we wanted to do, where our parents probably wouldn't allow us to do, or what we thought we could have done if we had a bit more support or a bit more freedom, and just plugging it into new human beings that have absolutely no idea what our trauma is?
Yeah, definitely. I definitely think so. I think because I wanted my child to live. I wanted to live vicariously through my child, basically, is the long and short of it. And then I realized that, hold on a minute, I can't live through him. So I've just let him be, do whatever he says he wants to do. We'll just pour the energy into that. And I think it's a trauma that we have to recognize, and it takes a while to recognize when you become a father, to recognize that is what's happening, because you just think, well, I'm doing the best for him because that's all I know, right?
So yeah, no, go on.
No, but once you recognize that and you start letting them being free, you start seeing a different version of your child. You start seeing potentially a challenging version of your child, because you start growing at the same level as them, because you're now having to be challenged as to some of the things they want to do, and they're almost to a stage where you don't want to be outgrown by them. So you start learning just as much as they do, so that you can grow at the same pace.
Yeah. There is a scene in there, which is, I think he's talking about, there's 2 elements. One where he was married in his first marriage, and he had his son, Trey. When Trey was 2, he divorced from his first wife, Cherie, and he was trying to really manufacture this access quite aggressively. and was failing quite badly. And it was very fictitious between him and Cherie at the time. And he went to his dad for advice. And his dad's advice was, you have to relax. And in a separation, the mother is always right, because you're never going to win a battle against the mother, because she has access and she gave birth to him. It just is. And his dad also said that when his son is 13, he will just come and find you. It would just happen. The more you fight, the harder it makes it. But once you just leave enough space, when he's 13 and he starts looking towards masculinity, he will realize that he needs to hear from his father, and he will come and find you. When do you feel you can be a good father if you're not a great partner? Do you feel like proximity has a great impact in the early years? Like when does daddying even kick in? Because I think we did a poll which said that, I think it was 46% of all dads felt as if they didn't become a father until their child was 5. That's just the awakening that they're a dad. And I'm pretty sure the latter part of it, the real contribution that they can make, their gift, probably comes a little bit later. How do you guys feel about that? I'll start with Marvyn and Chris, because Donald just went.
I think for me, one of the things that I first realized is, even if you don't feel like a father when your partner's pregnant or the mother of your child is pregnant, what's very important is getting on the birth certificate. And I think not a lot of men, I found this because I used to work in a call center, and I took calls for registrars, and getting on the birth certificate gets you 50%, parental responsibility. And what I tended to find is that a lot of fathers wouldn't get on the birth certificate, and then much later in their child's life, they'd want access, they'd want their parental responsibility, but there's no legal basis for it. The only way you can get that is via a DNA test, and the only way you can get that is obviously with the mother's approval, or under the say-so of a judge. So without that, if the mum just decides we want to move country, you've got no say if you're not on the birth certificate.
That's huge.
It's massive, and I think it's still a blind spot for a lot of people. They don't realize that, do you know what, even if I don't feel like that now, and I might want to be a father later on in their life, in getting on the birth certificate is imperative. So I think I realized that in terms of your understanding, it needs to change from then straight away. That should be your mindset. But separate to that, sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say, but can you be a good father? Because that's very interesting, and I love that, and I want to unpack that a bit more. But can you be a good father if you're not a great partner? Because many times you have unhealthy relationships with love, intimacy, connection. And so you get into a relationship, you may not have all the skills to be successful at it. It may not work. But the idea that you can't be a good parent, or you can be a good parent, is that just baked in? Like, how do you demark the differences between what you do as a partner and the values and what you do as a father? Is there any difference?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think there is a difference. I think you can definitely be a good father, even if you weren't a good partner. And I think because fathering's for life, whereas partnering it could be when you're adolescent, it could be when you're young, it could be you going through a rough patch, whereas you've got the whole of your life, because you're going to, your child will outlive you. You've got the whole of your life to perfect yourself and be an effective father. But that's why I kind of superseded that with the birth certificate, because if you haven't done that, you might...
You're not even in the game.
You're not even in the game, exactly. And then when you do get your awakening, 5 years later, you've grown out of that mindset. Unfortunately, the mother might close the door on you and there's no way to get in. So you do need to kind of use foresight and say, I don't know what will happen in the future, but my aim is to improve. So I'm going to make a decision now that gives me something to hold on to in the future.
And the other thing I would say is that when it comes to being a partner, because this is something that obviously is quite relevant to me at the moment, and actually in the early stages, my role as a partner was being conflated with my role as a father, which I was very quick to draw a line on, because I have no intention of letting up on my responsibility as a father. But I think the other thing to note is that, especially if we're talking about first child, nobody has more experience than the other. Nobody is qualified to say that your failings as a partner or your ability as a partner is a reflection of your ability as a parent.
There's another thing. Will Smith described his divorce from his first wife as his biggest failure. Do you see divorce as a failure?
Well,
I think it's a concept that was probably drilled in back then, when if you're divorced, it was more of a taboo, and the idea and the school of thought that divorcing is almost not fulfilling, and you stayed in a marriage regardless of what happened, because once you were married, it took a lot more to get to that marriage status. So once you divorced, you were breaking not just you, not just you going apart, but you were breaking up two families that had put so much work to come together, right? So I think it's definitely, in this day and age, it's definitely not seen as a failure, because if a marriage is not right, marriage is not a prison sentence, right? And it shouldn't be seen like that. Whereas back then it was seen as you have to serve your time regardless of what happens. And it comes from a very different generational school of thought, in my opinion.
Yeah. Chris, Marvyn, is
So,
divorce a failure?
Divorce is abhorred in my faith, in the Baha'i faith. But I think the terminology failure, I don't mind that being used. I think it's in a technical sense, yes, but in terms of how you use that or how you respond,
Stigma around the word failure.
Exactly, yeah. I think it's up to you. So I personally wouldn't use the word failure, just because I feel like in life, sometimes, unfortunately, some people have to touch the fire before they understand it's hot, and you shouldn't be doing that. Or, you get what I'm saying. You have to go through something before you understand where you could have done better, and, it can be at the point where there's no return.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's
Marvyn. Do you take divorce separation as a failure? We obviously do this with good intentions. Everyone that gets together doesn't get together with the grand vision of necessarily marriage. Some people might just be together, have children, try, and it doesn't work. But would you consider that a failure? And if that's a failure, who is it a failure for and on? What's the cause that it's a failure for?
I think for me, I wouldn't, similar to what Chris said, I wouldn't see it as a failure, but I think there needs to be a marked effort to say, okay, this isn't the end. Like, some people, I think at the point of divorce, they may step away as a father, they may start another life, they may start another family. So I think it needs to be a very conscious decision that, I think, as Chris said, there's kind of like a demarcation that that's the end of a chapter, but do you allow that to be the end of you as a father? And if you decide no, and I'm going to continue to be the most effective father I can be, although I'm no longer with the mother, then yeah, there could be a net positive out of that. You might be a better couple or better co-parent in relationship, even though you're divorced, than you would have been if you were together. So I think, again, it's back to like the kind of the net output overall. And just back to the example I gave at the beginning, I grew up with friends whose both parents were married, but as Donald said, it might not have been the most healthy environment. And so it might not have been the most conducive to kind of like their upbringing. So it's just about, yeah, I think you just got to be very sensitive, just listen and just adapt. But no, I wouldn't see it as a failure.
I also think one thing that kind of divorce and separation kind of brings about is the importance of working on oneself before jumping into those relationships. Before, the importance of being at a level where you can be your authentic
Isn't that a
self,
form of privilege, though? The awareness of kind of like, I think about myself at 20 years old. I was just grateful that someone would let me actually have sex with them, let alone the idea of that I needed to be mentally prepared for the act of what could ultimately create a child. Isn't that a very reflective way of looking at it? Like, I'm in my 30s now, I can look back and be like, you 20-year-olds don't know what you're doing. Whereas at 20, I was just like, please, thank you.
If I had to say one thing that I don't believe in now, from my experience, it would be that there is some kind of formula that ensures you will be successful in marriage. There is no fixed formula, because you're going to have your own trauma to deal with. You're going to have things that you don't know about yourself until you're in a marriage. You're going to have situations that you have not been in before. And then along with all of these things is the constant reminder that you've signed up for this for life. And so you need to find a way out, and not find a way out, of the marriage, but you need to find a way to handle this on a consistent basis. And, for some, there will be resilience or ways around, and for others, there won't.
But cool. Shouldn't there be, don't you think there should be an invitation for individuals, especially men, to have that conversation a lot earlier than we did? For
sure. I did, but I did a course. Literally did a course on communication. So with my wife, and so like I say, there's no fixed formula.
So look, we've got a few minutes left. I just want a quick fire, and I would like everyone to answer as succinctly as possible. So one of the things that I found really kind of clear is there was a point where he was communicating and saying he basically had some very strong views about co-parenting, and he didn't want to go into it too much because he didn't think that was the space or the platform, and also didn't feel like it would be understood in the correct way. What he was alluding to is that mothers have to give space to fathers to father in the way that fathers want to, not in the way that mothers think their dads, their partners should be fathering. Do you feel appreciated as a father, genuinely?
Yes.
As much as I can be, I guess, at the moment. I think I'm learning to just pat myself on the back. At this stage, I can't really look for credit, external validation, that word, because I've got a lot to pick myself up from. And so if there's one thing that I'm taking pride in and doing to the best of my ability because I want to, it's being a dad and a present dad.
Marvyn, is your daddying appreciated?
Yeah, I'd say it is, and I think much more so now he's a lot older that you can see the output from it. I remember an example, like when we first bought him a bike, and I was like, we went to the park and I was like, you're going to learn to ride this bike today. And similar to like what Will Smith said, I was very militant about it. And I think it's something where his mom would have wanted to give in and would have said, let's come back another day. But within an hour, with that determination and that strict parenting, it succeeded. And so I think some of my methods were then believed in because you could see the result of it. You could see that there was a change or there was a positive outcome. So I think sometimes there needs to be proof in the pudding to see that what you're doing is actually effective.
Will says the biggest lesson that he learned from his father was that you can't build anyone if you're not willing to suffer. What lessons did you learn, or did your dad drum into you, that had the bordering of suffering attached to it? Do you agree with that statement first and foremost? And what was that big thing that you learned from that feeling that was created by your dad's presence, absence, energy, frequency, whatever he had to share?
I think for me was structure. Having a structure to everything you do, planning everything you do. From getting up in the morning, making your bed, brushing your teeth, and making sure the night before your shoes are polished or whatever it is you're gonna wear is clean and put to one side. Your stuff is ironed. That kind of structure was what I think I went through, that suffering of not wanting to do it or getting up that bit earlier to do it. And I'm so appreciative of that now, because I'm now drumming that into my children, and I can see the benefits of it.
For me, I would say, sorry, new question?
No, go for it.
No, I was just going to say, like, in keeping with what, using my dad as an example of what I didn't want to do, I would say reading the room is something I learned, because my dad is a character who definitely imposes himself, when he's around, jokes and whatever. And for me, I kind of, learned to actually adapt to what's going on in the room and not always have to be at the center.
Yeah.
That hurt my spirit.
What would you say was your father's superpower as a dad?
He had a couple of things that were like spectacular. The strongest thing is he was a teacher. Every single moment was a teaching moment.
Right.
He believed that school wasn't the only place you got an education, and school was actually in his way. And his thing was, you can't father from a distance. He wanted his kids beside him while he was doing the thing that he was best in the world at, so he could be seen in his best light and he could teach from moment to moment.
One very quickly, what would you say your dad's superhero trait is? He had this thing about communicating his dad as like his superhero trait was, or his superpower was, that discipline, that militancy. What's your superpower? What's the gift that you give to your family, to your children in the most succinct way possible?
Mm.
Do you think it's problematic that we don't know, like on the tip of our tongue?
I think I know mine, but I don't think how to. Sacrifice is probably the best way because I think I'm the kind of character that's quite giving of everything, and my kids see that, and I've seen them kind of carry that out, and I think they'll definitely say, and I would say that is my superhero strength that I'll be giving to my kids, and I often say to them, giving is the key to living. You know, you have to give in order to live. You have to give yourself, your authentic self, in order to live.
Who energizes you then? Who gives you that back? Where do you get that power from? Because if you keep depleting yourself, and maybe depleting is not the correct word, but who energizes you then?
Internal resets, I think, energize me. I think often and
That's a
consistently.
fucking t-shirt you just said. Say that again with caps lock. Say that with caps lock. Say it with your chest.
Internal resets. But that is, I think for me, that is what has constantly got and you know, constantly got to happen, and regularly it's got to happen all the time, to make sure that I'm also re-energizing myself in order to be able to give. You've heard the saying, you can't pour from an empty cup, right? So that is where, for me, I've got to keep resetting myself on a regular basis.
Yeah. Anyone else? What's your superhero power?
For me, it's just continuous learning, like always being willing to learn, and also being like humble enough to say that you may not know, or you may have that kind of gap or that blind spot. So yeah, just continuous learning, always reevaluating how I do things. You know, there's a quote, what's the point in having a mind if you never change it? That what I might have thought today and held as a strong belief today, I might be changed tomorrow because I might learn something new. So I think that's something that I've learned, and something I do impart to my son. And when he does ask me a question that I don't know the answer to, we'll go and find the answer together, or I'll challenge him to find the answer and to come back to me with it. And I think there's a humility in that, because there is that aspect of parents know everything, or, you know, what dad says or what mum says is the final answer, where now Google or YouTube will give you a better answer. So let's go and find the answer together.
I'm going to say mine is to encourage creativity and like match energy. Obviously, my daughter's only 2, but there's 2 important things. I think one is to get on her level. So if she just wants to read a book, of course, if she wants to jump, we'll keep jumping until I'm knackered. And then, yeah, I can make a game out of anything, not always successfully, as some people who've been to house parties will tell you, but I can make games out of just an object and entertain.
I think that's been clearly communicated by our good friend Simone.
What's yours, Marvyn?
She's a big fan of your games. Sorry, Donald, what'd you say?
What's yours?
I kind of feel like I'm a coach. I'm an energizer. I'm always coaching them. I'm always talking to them like, this is the final inch before you win the Super Bowl. And I think that's my gift, is that I'm trying to create space and give enough options for him to choose the best choices possible, where even the bad choice is a good choice. So I'm constantly trying to balance that out. Sort of, what does he see? What does he compute from the experience that he's just had? Trying to catch meanings before they turn into new behaviors. So I think my gift is the kind of champion coaching. I talk to him literally like he's about to take a penalty to win the World Cup all the time. It's brilliant. For me, I thoroughly enjoy it. My last question, which I think is really important, we actually did a whole podcast on this for the BBC, which was, before your dad passed away, what is that final message and closure that you need to have? Have you had that conversation? Have you freed yourself from your father and his behaviors before you go on to become a father? I always feel like before you become a dad, you should have that conversation and close that chapter of you being a child in their eyes and in your own eyes, to actually become a dad that your child can genuinely take from. Have you guys had that conversation or tried to?
Yeah, I'm really happy that actually, in terms of how much I believe he will comprehend because of the generational difference, the cultural difference, I think I have said what I've had to say. I think I'm unafraid now to say I love you, which definitely couldn't have imagined at age 18, 19, 20, 21. So yeah, that's probably one thing I would say I feel complete.
Marvyn?
I'm yet to have that conversation, but it is, yeah, something that I've been reflecting on, even over this lockdown. And
Will
how
you be
important.
moving some furniture around? I know you both do taekwondo, so is it going to get like that, or is it a conversation?
Nah, he'll still whoop me. Like, I mean, I think that's one thing. That,
60, that's fantastic.
even recently, he's still training my son. My son now does Brazilian jiu-jitsu and Muay Thai. I'm trying to get him to be like a bit of a mixed martial artist. So even my son's gonna have to kick my ass as well in a couple of years, which is a little scary.
You're going to be completely terrorized in all
Yeah.
sorts of for part of your life, bro. You just need to get a bat.
But I think, yeah, so I'm yet to have that conversation with my father, but I think mine will be around, and I acknowledge you did your best. And, you know, there's a lot that I can learn from that. There's, as Will said, there's areas where I can improve, but I acknowledge that you did your best and you didn't fail me. I think that's an important conversation to have, because
I didn't even use that. I haven't even thought of that. So maybe I need to throw that one into.
yeah. So I think, yeah, that's something that I'd say.
Donald, what is your words going to be, and how are you going to get closure or open?
I mean,
Have you done that already?
well, I've attempted to. I've attempted to a number of times before I got married, before I had my first child, and even recently I've tried to. And I think if I was successful in having that conversation, it will be the case of I'm not looking back at what you did. I'm looking at what you do now, and I acknowledge, you know, similar to what Marvyn said, I acknowledge that you did the best you could at the time. But you know, I'm still. He hasn't been present enough to share his narrative with me yet. So I've had a one-sided narrative from my mum, and not had his side of things. So I'm still conscious that that might change things around a little bit. But for me, I'm at peace with the fact that he hasn't been around. He did what he could at the time, on what he thought was best, and we just need to look at how we move things forward. So I even reached out to his daughter, who surprisingly didn't come back to me. So I find that very interesting as well, what kind of narrative was spun about me.
Interesting. Guys, thank you so much. Chris, I very much appreciate you sticking around. I know you had things you needed to do, so I very much appreciate, and your contribution is first class as always. Marvyn, you're not as scary as the Daily Mail says that your profile should be. Your voice definitely is something that I would like to steal. I'm still working on a solution.
Getting that module, yeah, where we can attach it to the voice notes.
Donald, thank you so much for your warmth as always. I think one thing I would say, though, is that this kind of this desire to become a dad, which one that I had very, very strongly, and became very loud, really needed to be preceded with some real work, as Donald says. I think it's very important that we take a challenge and try to introduce younger people into understanding their load before they go off into the world and try to create children. To be fair, as soon as they're sexually active, these questions should be answered, because the act of sex is already a precursor to the possibility of having children, and people obviously disconnect that from what actually is possible. I think another area which was really loud was when Will Smith talked about the access of these children. And we know many fathers and black fathers have trouble accessing, or have not chosen to be accessed, or not chosen to be on the birth certificate and be present in the lives. And there's a good group of them trying to reconcile that. The road is long, and ultimately you are at the whim of the mother, and rightly so, because they have to protect the person that you co-created. And I think it's very important that there is an element of consistency that is seen before access is given, so that you don't ultimately create more problematic experiences for your child down the line. So I think it is our work, and I think it's something that we find in our spaces, and we always try to champion a resolution from the position that men have to carry the load, take the burden on the chin, and not complain about what's not happening as an act of defiance or act of a reason not to do more. So that's very, very loud to me. I think also the idea around what the ambitions are of our children is fundamentally vital, because our children are already created. They are who they are the second that they arrive, and we necessarily can influence, but really what we end up doing is erasing their presence from the earth. We erase who they actually are and then try to create a newer, smaller version of us that's slightly better. And I think that's such a toxic idea. And I think we kind of lose the magic of discovering who our children are if we spend so much time telling them who they need to be, which is based on our perception. And I think that's also a thing that happened historically that definitely needs to be eroded. But I do want to thank Will and Jada, my two very close friends who I speak to obviously every day, the way I'm speaking about them. But I really like the idea of just insight into established, long-term, successful relationships is a huge benefit, because not everybody has had the benefit of doing it. Guys, thank you so much. You are always brighten up my day when I share space with you, and thank you for all your honesty and authenticity on this subject. Hopefully you go and do something powerful now and go hug your kids, because I'm going to go hug mine. Any last statements?
Where can people find the video?
The video, I'm actually going to cut some of it in, but it'll also be in the description as well. I'm gonna edit some of it into this episode, because I think it's important to give the context to some of the key areas. So you will see it.
Amazing.
Where can they find you guys, if they're allowed to? I know some of you are hiding.
Be Chris Bex on everything. That will be all.
Donald, where can you be found?
Instagram, Donald Butcher. On Facebook, Donald Butcher. On Twitter, Donald Champion.
We're going to unpack that another day, why you have two names. Marvyn?
Yeah, I'm working on my social media presence at the moment, but I'd say Facebook, Marvyn Critchlow, and LinkedIn, Marvyn Critchlow.
Bruv, you do not want people on your Facebook, bruv, scrolling back. 2000,
yeah. No,
you had the mad outfit when you had the bootcut jeans that were just a mad color, bro, from Blue Ink. I know that picture exists,
Blue
bro.
Ink.
Yes.
Oh my
They're like 2 jeans for like £20.
Yeah.
Guys, thank you so much. Please make sure you find us at Dope Black Dads on every single platform. You can email me, hello@dopeblackdads.com on any of the email servers that you have. You can go to our website and find our clothing and more information about us at dopeblackdads.com. And that's it, really. Don't find me anywhere else, because I need breaks. See you later. Thank you, guys.
Peace.
Thank you.
Thanks.